I never imagined that at 68, my life could crumble as quickly as a house of cards in a hurricane. Robert passed away in his sleep on a cold February morning, quietly and peacefully, just as he had lived these past few years. 43 years of marriage came to an end when I discovered his still form in our king-sized bed, the same bed where we had shared countless mornings, dreams, and whispered conversations in the darkness. The grief hit me like a tidal wave, but I held myself together. Eleanor Winston had always held herself together, no matter what life threw at her. It was what women of my generation did. We endured, we persevered, we maintained our dignity, even when the world fell apart around us. The funeral was everything Robert would have wanted: dignified, well-attended, befitting a man who had built his construction company from nothing into a multi-million-dollar empire. The entire business community of our small Georgia town came to pay their respects. I stood beside the mahogany casket in my black Chanel suit, the one I had bought 20 years ago and saved for special occasions, never imagining that such an occasion would be my husband's funeral. People squeezed my hand, murmured condolences, and spoke of Robert's integrity, his generosity, his devotion to family. If only they knew, I thought bitterly, but kept my composure. I was the grieving widow, playing my role to perfection, while inside I felt oddly disconnected from the proceedings, as if I were watching someone else's life unfold. The first blow came exactly 1 week after we laid Robert to rest. His longtime attorney, Mr. Harrison, invited me to his downtown office for the reading of the will. I expected it to be a formality. Everything would pass to me, as it should after 4 decades of marriage. I had been Robert's partner in building his business, his companion through countless business dinners, his support through every challenge. But as Mr. Harrison told me, I had no other purpose but to please him for everything. But, as Mr. Harrison told me, I had no other purpose but to please him for everything. But as Mr. Harrison told me, I had no other purpose but to please him for everything. But as Mr. Harrison told me, I had no other purpose but to please him for everything. But as Mr. Harrison told me, I had no other purpose for Bob. But as Mr. Harrison told me, I had no other purpose for Bob but to please him for everything. But as Mr. Harrison told me, I had no other purpose for Bob but to please him for everything. Harrison began to read the legal document. My carefully constructed world started to crumble. Half of Robert's estate, the house we had built together, the stock portfolio we had carefully cultivated, the bank accounts that represented a lifetime of shared work, everything was being left to someone named Savannah Blake. The name rang a bell somewhere in the recesses of my memory, but I couldn't place it. Harrison cleared his throat uncomfortably and explained that Miss Blake had been Robert's personal secretary for the past 3 years, 29 years old, blonde, very capable. The way he said capable made my stomach clench with understanding. I sat in that leather chair, feeling my hands go numb, my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone in the room could hear it. 43 years of marriage, of being the dutiful wife, the perfect hostess, the supportive partner, and my husband had left half of everything we had built together to a girl young enough to be our daughter. A very capable secretary. I wasn't naive. I understood the implication immediately. but hearing it confirmed in legal terms, in that sterile office, filled with law books and certificates, made it real in a way that no amount of suspicion could have prepared me for. That night, I locked myself in Robert's study and allowed myself to cry for the first time since his death. Not tears of grief for my deceased husband, but tears of humiliation, of betrayal, of the crushing realization that the last years of our marriage had been built on a foundation of lies. I remembered how Robert had started working later at the office, how he had become more attentive to me at home, bringing me flowers for no reason, complimenting my cooking, asking about my day with what I had mistaken for renewed interest. Now I understood it was guilt, his way of trying to balance the scales for his betrayal. The next morning, I drove to Robert's office building for the first time since his death. The construction company occupied the entire third floor of the renovated downtown building that Robert had bought and restored 15 years ago. Gloria, the elderly receptionist who had been with the company for decades, greeted me with tears in her eyes and a sympathetic embrace. Gloria had known me since the early days when I would bring Robert lunch on the construction sites, when we were young and struggling and dreaming of the empire we would build together. She had attended our anniversary parties, sent cards when we lost our parents, celebrated every milestone of our marriage. Over coffee in the break room, Gloria told me more about Savannah Blake than I wanted to know, but needed to hear. Young, ambitious, beautiful in that effortless way that only comes with youth. She had arrived 3 years ago, fresh from secretarial school, eager to please and quick to learn. She had become indispensable to Robert, staying late to help with important projects, traveling with him to business meetings, gradually inserting herself into every aspect of his professional life. Gloria didn't say it outright. She was too kind, too loyal to speak ill of the dead. But her meaningful glances and careful pauses told me everything I needed to know. The entire office had known about Robert's affair. I had been the only one living in blissful ignorance. I made a decision that day, sitting in that break room surrounded by the familiar sounds of the business Robert and I had built together. I would not go quietly into the night. At 68 years old, I was not about to meekly hand over half of what we had created to his young mistress. I would fight. My bridge club friends recommended a lawyer, David Campbell, a specialist in estate law. He was expensive, they warned, but he was the best in the state. If anyone could help me contest Robert's will, it would be him. I spent the night before our meeting lying awake, staring at the ceiling of the bedroom I had shared with Robert for so many years. What would I tell this lawyer? How could I explain that my life had been shattered not just by death, but by the discovery that the man I had loved and trusted had betrayed me in the most fundamental way? David Campbell's office was on the 23rd floor of the tallest building in downtown Atlanta, an hour's drive from my small town. The view from his conference room was breathtaking. The city sprawled out below, like a glittering promise of possibility. His secretary, a professional woman about my age, offered me coffee and settled me into a comfortable chair to wait. When David entered the room, I was struck by his presence. He was tall, probably in his early 60s, with distinguished silver hair and kind brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He moved with the confident grace of a man who had spent decades in courtrooms, fighting for his clients' rights. David listened to my story with the practiced attention of someone who had heard it all before. But there was something in his expression that told me he understood this wasn't just another case to me. This was my life, my dignity, my future security hanging in the balance. He explained that contesting a will was never easy, especially when it appeared to be legally sound. But there were several avenues we could explore. We could attempt to prove undue influence, argue that Robert wasn't of sound mind when he changed his will, or look for procedural errors in how the document was executed. The legal fees would be substantial, he warned. This kind of case could drag on for months, maybe years. The emotional toll would be significant. Was I prepared for that kind of battle? Looking into his steady gaze, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The sense that someone was truly listening to me, taking my concerns seriously, treating me as more than just the grieving widow who should quietly accept her fate. "Mr. Campbell," I said, "I've been preparing for this battle my entire life. I just didn't know it." But then something unexpected happened. A week later, David called to inform me that Savannah Blake had retained an attorney to protect her interests in the will contest. The attorney she had chosen was David himself. I was speechless. How could he represent both sides? How could he fight for my interests while simultaneously protecting hers? When I found my voice, I demanded an explanation. David's voice was pained, as he explained that his firm had been contacted by Miss Blake's representatives before I had come to see him. Professional ethics required him to honor the prior commitment. He offered to refer me to another excellent attorney in his firm, someone who would represent my interests with the same dedication he would have brought to the case. But I insisted on meeting with him face to face. I needed to look into the eyes of the man who would be defending my husband's mistress, who would be arguing that a 29-year-old secretary deserved half of what I had spent a lifetime building. We met at a small cafe near the courthouse, neutral territory where we could speak freely. David arrived precisely on time, and I could see the regret in his eyes as he approached my table. He apologized for the awkward situation and assured me that he would conduct himself with the utmost professionalism throughout the proceedings. But our conversation didn't go as I had expected. David wasn't the cold, calculating lawyer I had imagined. He was warm, thoughtful, and surprisingly vulnerable. He told me about his own recent divorce after 30 years of marriage, about the pain of discovering that the person you trusted most in the world had been living a lie. His wife had left him for a younger man, he explained. She had been having an affair for 2 years before she finally found the courage to ask for a divorce. The betrayal had shattered his faith in love, in commitment, in the possibility of happiness in the later years of life. I found myself listening intently, forgetting for a moment why we were there. David spoke about the unique pain of betrayal in our generation, how it felt different when you were past 60 and thought you had weathered all of life's storms. The humiliation was sharper, the sense of wasted time more acute, the fear of starting over more paralyzing. But he had learned to live with it, he said. He had discovered that even in our 60s, there was still time for new experiences, new relationships, new sources of joy. It was a lesson that had taken him years to learn, but one that had ultimately saved him from bitterness. We parted that day as unlikely allies, adversaries in legal terms, but kindred spirits in our shared experience of betrayal. I understood that David would fulfill his professional obligations to Savannah, but something in his manner told me that his heart was on my side. The following weeks passed in a blur of legal preparations. My new attorney, Mr. Johnson, was competent but cold, treating my case as an intellectual puzzle rather than a human tragedy. He was skilled at finding legal loopholes and procedural errors, but he had no interest in my emotional journey or my need for justice that went beyond monetary compensation. David called me several times during this period, ostensibly about procedural matters, but our conversations always wandered into more personal territory. He would ask about my day, share stories about his grown children who lived in other states, discuss books he was reading or movies he had seen. These conversations became the bright spots in my increasingly dark days. I found myself looking forward to his calls, preparing things to tell him about my life, my memories, my thoughts about the future. It had been years since anyone had shown such genuine interest in my opinions, my experiences, my dreams. With Robert, our conversations in recent years had been limited to practical matters, schedules, social obligations, business concerns. One evening, David called as I was sitting in my garden, watching the sunset and trying to make sense of my new reality. Our conversation meandered through various topics until he suddenly said, "Eleanor, I know this is highly irregular, but would you like to have dinner with me sometime? Not about the case, just as friends." The invitation hung in the air between us like a bridge across a chasm. I was lonely, I realized. Desperately lonely, in a way that had nothing to do with Robert's death and everything to do with the gradual erosion of intimacy in our marriage over the past several years. "I'd like that," I heard myself saying, surprising us both. We met at a small Italian restaurant on the outskirts of town, a place where we were unlikely to encounter anyone from my social circle or his professional network. David was dressed casually in a navy blazer and khakis, looking younger and more relaxed than he had in his office. We talked for hours about everything except the legal case that had brought us together. He told me about his passion for jazz music, his love of travel, his regret at not spending more time with his children when they were young. I shared memories of my early marriage, my dreams of having children that had never materialized, my secret love of painting that I had abandoned when social obligations became more demanding. For the first time in years, I felt like a complete person rather than just someone's wife or widow. David listened to me with an intensity that was both flattering and slightly overwhelming. When had Robert stopped looking at me that way? When had I stopped feeling worthy of that kind of attention? As we walked to our cars after dinner, David took my hand and said, "Eleanor, I want you to know that whatever happens with this legal case, meeting you has been the best thing that's happened to me in a very long time." I squeezed his hand, feeling a flutter of something I thought had died years ago. "David, you're making a complicated situation even more complicated." "I know," he said, his thumb tracing circles on my palm. "But life is messy, isn't it? Maybe it's time I stopped trying to keep everything so perfectly organized." Our relationship deepened over the following weeks. We met for coffee, attended a jazz concert together, took long walks through the historic district of my town. David showed me aspects of life I had forgotten existed. The pleasure of intellectual conversation, the thrill of discovering new experiences, the comfort of being with someone who accepted me exactly as I was. But the shadow of the legal case hung over everything. David was still representing Savannah, still obligated to protect her interests against mine. It was an impossible situation that we both tried to ignore, but couldn't escape. Then came the bombshell that changed everything. During a routine meeting with David to discuss procedural matters, he informed me that Savannah was claiming to be pregnant with Robert's child. She was requesting that the court consider the interests of the unborn child in determining the distribution of the estate. The news hit me like a physical blow. I had to grip the edge of the conference table to keep from falling. Not only had my husband been unfaithful, not only had he left half our estate to his mistress, but he had also gotten her pregnant. At 70 years old, Robert was going to be a father, and that child would inherit more than I would after 4 decades of marriage. I excused myself from the meeting and drove home in a daze. The house felt different now, haunted not just by Robert's absence, but by the knowledge of his betrayal. I wandered through the rooms we had decorated together, past the photographs of our life that now seemed like elaborate lies. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I would not be defeated by this final insult. If Savannah wanted to play dirty, I would find a way to fight back. I began searching through Robert's papers more systematically than I had before, looking for anything that might help my case. Most of Robert's important documents were kept in his office, but he had always maintained a small safe in our bedroom for personal papers. I had never paid much attention to its contents, trusting Robert to handle our financial affairs. Now, I methodically examined every document, every receipt, every piece of correspondence. Hidden in a folder marked medical records was a file I had never seen before. It contained reports from a surgery Robert had undergone 15 years ago, a procedure he had never mentioned to me. According to the medical records, the surgery had resulted in sterility. My husband had been incapable of fathering children for the past 15 years. I sat on our bedroom floor, surrounded by scattered papers, and began to laugh. It was a bitter, hysterical sound that echoed through the empty house. Savannah's pregnancy was a lie, an elaborate fraud designed to strengthen her claim to Robert's estate. The child she was carrying could not possibly be his. My first instinct was to call Mr. Johnson immediately, to share this explosive information that would destroy Savannah's case. But something held me back. I needed to think about this carefully, to consider all the implications before acting. The next morning, I called David and asked to meet with him urgently. We met at our usual cafe, but this time I could barely contain my excitement. I told him about the medical records, about the proof that Robert couldn't have fathered Savannah's child. David listened in stunned silence, his face growing paler as I explained the implications. When I finished, he sat quietly for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. "Eleanor," he said finally, "as Savannah's attorney, I should probably advise you not to use this information, since it was obtained through searching Robert's private papers. But as someone who's come to care about you deeply, I have to say that justice seems to be on your side." He looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. This case has put me in an impossible position. I can't honestly represent Savannah's interests when I feel the way I do about you, but I can't abandon a client in the middle of a legal proceeding. I reached across the table and took his hand. "David, what if there was a way to resolve this that didn't require you to choose between professional ethics and personal feelings?" That afternoon, I drove to Savannah's apartment. She lived in a modern complex on the newer side of town. the kind of place young professionals chose when they wanted to appear successful. I had never seen her in person, only in photographs that Gloria had discreetly shown me. When she opened the door, I was struck by how young she looked. 29, according to the legal documents, but she could have passed for 24. She was beautiful in that fresh, unlined way that only comes with youth, with blonde hair and blue eyes that widened in recognition when she saw me. "Mrs. Winston," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't expecting you." "May I come in?" I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. Savannah's apartment was expensively furnished, clearly beyond what a secretary's salary could afford. She offered me tea with shaking hands and settled into a chair across from me, unconsciously placing her hands protectively over her slightly rounded belly. "I know why you're here," she said, her voice stronger now. "You want me to give up my claim to Mr. Winston's estate." "No," I said quietly. "I want you to tell me the truth about whose child you're carrying." The color drained from her face. For a moment, I thought she might faint. Then she began to cry. Not the delicate tears of a manipulative young woman, but the raw, broken sobs of someone whose world was collapsing. Between her tears, Savannah told me her story. She had grown up in foster care, aging out of the system at 18 with no family, no support, no real education beyond high school. She had worked her way through secretarial school, dreaming of a stable job that would give her security. And she was hired at Robert's company. She had no intention of having an affair with her boss. But Robert was kind to her, interested in her opinions, generous with compliments and small gifts. He made her feel valued in a way no one ever had. "The affair began gradually," she explained. "Robert was lonely in his marriage, hungry for the attention and admiration of someone who saw him as powerful and successful, rather than just a familiar presence. Savannah was equally lonely, craving the security and affection that Robert offered. But she had never stopped seeing her previous boyfriend, a man her own age who worked construction. When she discovered she was pregnant, she knew the child was his, not Robert's. But she also knew that Robert desperately wanted to believe he could still father a child, that he could prove his virility, even in his 70s. "I never meant for it to go this far," she sobbed. "I thought Mr. Winston would just leave me a small amount of money. Maybe enough to get me started somewhere else. I never expected him to change his will so dramatically." I listened to her confession with a mixture of anger and pity. Anger at the deception, the manipulation, the way she had exploited Robert's loneliness and vanity. But also pity for a young woman who had been so desperate for security that she had built her life on a foundation of lies. "What do you want me to do?" she asked finally, her tears subsiding. I looked at this frightened girl who had unknowingly destroyed my marriage, and I made a decision that surprised even me. "I want you to tell the truth," I said. "I want you to withdraw your claim about the child's paternity. In exchange, I won't contest the rest of the will. You can keep what Robert left you, but you won't get additional support for a child that isn't his." Savannah stared at me in amazement. "You would do that? After everything I've done?" "You're not the only one who made mistakes," I said. "Robert chose to have an affair. He chose to lie to both of us. I can't punish you for his decisions." The resolution of the case was swift once Savannah agreed to modify her claims. David handled the legal details with his usual efficiency, but I could see the relief in his eyes when the ethical conflict was finally resolved. The night after the final court hearing, David took me to dinner at an elegant restaurant in Atlanta. We had never been able to truly relax together before, always aware of the legal complications that surrounded our relationship. Now, for the first time, we could simply be two people enjoying each other's company. "I have something to tell you," David said as we lingered over dessert. "I've been thinking about retiring. This case made me realize that I don't want to spend my remaining years fighting other people's battles. I want to focus on my own life, my own happiness." He reached across the table and took my hand. "Eleanor, I know this might seem sudden, but I've fallen in love with you. I want to spend whatever time we have left together, if you'll have me." I squeezed his hand, feeling a warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the wine we had shared. "David, 6 months ago, I thought my life was over. I was prepared to spend my remaining years alone, bitter and defeated. You've shown me that it's possible to start over, even at our age." "Is that a yes?" he asked, smiling. "That's a yes," I said, and meant it. David sold his practice, and I put the family home on the market. We bought a villa in Tuscany, a decision that scandalized some of my friends, but thrilled our children. David's son and daughter flew in from California and New York to meet me, and I was touched by how warmly they welcomed me into their family. The villa was everything we had dreamed of. Rolling hills covered with vineyards, a stone house with thick walls and terracotta floors, a garden where we could grow herbs and vegetables. We spent our days exploring the countryside, our evenings cooking together and talking about everything and nothing. I painted again for the first time in decades, setting up an easel in the garden and capturing the changing light on the Tuscan landscape. David read voraciously, often sharing interesting passages with me as we sat on the terrace in the evenings. We learned Italian together, laughing at our mistakes and celebrating small victories. 6 months after we moved to Italy, I received a letter from Savannah. She had given birth to a healthy baby boy and was doing well. She had found a new job as an office manager and was dating a man who accepted her son as his own. She thanked me again for my kindness and enclosed a photograph of the baby. Looking at the picture, I felt only happiness for her. The child was beautiful, innocent of the circumstances that had brought him into the world. Everyone deserved a chance at happiness, regardless of their past mistakes. I wrote back, including a small check for the baby's college fund. Life was too short to hold grudges, especially against a child who had done nothing wrong. Savannah's response was grateful and warm, and we began a correspondence that continues to this day. Now, as I sit on our terrace, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, I marvel at the unexpected turns life has taken. David is in the garden, tending to his tomatoes, occasionally looking up to smile at me. We have found a peace together that I never knew was possible. At 70 years old, I have learned that it's never too late to start over, never too late to find love, never too late to pursue the dreams you thought you had abandoned. The betrayal that initially devastated me ultimately led me to a happiness I never could have imagined. Sometimes I think about Robert, about the man I married and the man he became. I don't hate him anymore. I understand that he was struggling with his own fears about aging, about mortality, about the gradual loss of the vitality that had defined him. His affair was wrong, but it was also understandably human. David and I don't talk much about our previous marriages, but when we do, it's with the wisdom that comes from having lived through disappointment and emerged stronger. We know that our time together is precious, that every day is a gift that shouldn't be wasted on regret or recrimination. Yesterday, David surprised me with tickets to the opera in Florence. Tonight, we're having dinner with the couple who lives in the villa next to ours, an Italian man and his American wife who have been married for 50 years. Tomorrow, we're planning to drive to the coast to spend a few days by the sea. These simple pleasures, these ordinary moments of contentment, feel more valuable than all the wealth I fought so hard to protect. Money can provide security, but it cannot provide the warmth of a hand in yours, the comfort of someone who truly understands you, the joy of discovering new experiences together. I think about the women of my generation, many of whom have resigned themselves to loneliness after losing their husbands. They assume that romantic love is a young person's game, that our role is to gracefully fade into the background and be content with memories. But I've learned that love doesn't have an expiration date. Passion doesn't end at 60 or 70 or 80. The heart's capacity for joy and connection doesn't diminish with age. It only deepens with experience and wisdom. David brings me a glass of wine and settles into the chair beside me. We sit in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade from the sky. In the distance, we can hear the bells of the village church calling people to evening prayers. "Any regrets?" David asks, as he does sometimes, half joking but also genuinely curious. I consider the question seriously, as I always do. "Only that it took me so long to find you," I say, and mean it. He takes my hand, tracing the lines on my palm with his finger. "Maybe we needed to go through everything we went through to be ready for this," he says. "Maybe we needed to learn what we didn't want before we could appreciate what we have." I know he's right. The young woman I was at 25 or even 45 wouldn't have been ready for David. I needed to experience loss, betrayal, and disappointment to fully appreciate the gift of finding someone who sees me clearly and loves me anyway. As the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky, I think about second chances, about the courage it takes to remain open to love, even after being hurt. I think about Savannah, raising her son and building a new life. I think about David, who risked professional complications to pursue a relationship that meant more to him than career success. Most of all, I think about the woman I've become, stronger, wiser, more compassionate than I was in my youth. Age hasn't diminished me, it has refined me, like wine that improves with careful aging. Tomorrow, we'll wake up in our beautiful villa and begin another day of this unexpected adventure. We'll drink coffee on the terrace, tend our garden, explore a new town, or simply enjoy each other's company. Each day is a gift, and we're determined not to waste a single one. The path that led me here was painful, marked by betrayal and loss, and the shattering of illusions I had held for decades. But it was also necessary, clearing away the debris of a life that had become stale and predictable, making room for something genuinely fulfilling. I wouldn't change any of it now. Not Robert's affair, not the legal battle, not even the months of pain and uncertainty. All of it was necessary to bring me to this moment, to this man to this life that feels more authentically mine than anything I've ever experienced. Second chances come in many forms, and they're available at any age to those brave enough to embrace them. I'm grateful every day that I found the courage to fight for mine, and even more grateful that I found someone willing to share it with me. The night is warm, the wine is good, and the man beside me is everything I never knew I was looking for. At 70, I'm finally, completely, joyfully alive. And that, I think, is the most beautiful second chance of all.